Hi, I'm Miguel Delaney, Chief Football Writer at The Independent. We're now down to the really serious business with only 4 teams left. So we've asked for your questions ahead of the semi-finals of Qatar 2022. Let's take a look at what you've asked. First up, Tom says that given Morocco's run has involved beating Belgium, Spain and Portugal along the way, this is surely one of the great underdog runs of the World Cup. Yeah, I think there's a fair question over whether they're the most unlikely semi-finalists of all time. Certainly in the modern era, but then in the modern era, of course, is a bit more closed off than if you want to go back to the 30s or the 1950s. And it's not just about the surprise them being there; it's also the way they've done it, in that they've got one of the best defensive records of all time. There's only been one other semi-finalist in history that's conceded fewer goals. That was Italy, who conceded none on the way to the 1990 semi-finals. Morocco conceded just one, and that was an own goal at that. So they kind of have this defensive aura to go with all this emotional power around them. Yeah, and so it is one of the great underdog runs and one of the great stories. I mean, I think before the tournament, people had talked them up as one of those teams who you don't really want to face because they're a bit awkward and they've got a bit of quality. But they've gone beyond that to do something absolutely historic. And so I'm genuinely struggling to think of someone that compares. I mean, obviously there was Korea in 2002, but they had home advantage in a way Morocco don't. Okay, people will point to the crowds at the games, but it's still not in Morocco. And it really is remarkable. Chris asks, how and where do England improve for the next major tournament? Well, that's kind of the odd thing about Saturday night's game, in that I actually thought England were really good. They pretty much illustrated they were there. I thought they were a better team against France in a way we've never really seen before in that type of game. They controlled it. And it does seem now that the team is kind of at a point of completion. And it is just about those fine details. And I'm not sure that actually comes down to improvement. I think that's one of those things that happens in this sort of game. Now, you could say you need to get past the mental step of actually going and winning one of those games. Because, I mean, for all they knocked out Colombia in the penalty shootout in 2018, with that being a significant step in itself, with all they beat Germany in the last 16 of the Euros, these weren't wins against big nations away from home. That's just one final psychological step. In addition to that, I suppose there's maybe the one remaining issue with Southgate, given I do think Southgate has actually banished a lot of the criticisms of, not least in terms of controlling these games. That's something England did really impressively against France. But maybe his in-game substitutions, and that's been a constant criticism as well, that he doesn't react to the state of play as impressively as other managers, and his substitutions don't always have that effect. Maybe that's something to look at. But then, of course, we don't actually know if Southgate's going to be in charge. It might be someone else. But in terms of the squad itself, I think they've come together really well. And England are at the point where, in terms of the quality of the players and the coherence of the team, they should be challenging for every tournament for the next few years now. Daniel asks, how at this stage of the tournament are these the best referees that FIFA could come up with? A controversial one there. One of the considerations, obviously, FIFA have to have in this situation is that generally they would want a referee who's from a different confederation to the two teams involved. So if England are playing Argentina, say, or France are playing Argentina, they wouldn't want a referee from UEFA or CONMEBOL. They'd have to go outside. And that does bring different refereeing appreciations from different football cultures. So interestingly, I saw Tim Vickery put it, the Brazilian football expert, that one of the reasons that the referee against France was so lax with something, particularly some of the fouls in, say, Bukayo Saka, was because he comes from the Brazilian league where there are so many fouls and there's so many stoppages. So he felt he had to adapt for the World Cup and let the game flow more. Now, that did lead to maybe some abrasive French play being awarded. But and this is the thing, a lot of this ultimately comes down to subjectivity and then adapting to a truly global competition. Shane wonders if Argentina against the Netherlands was the game of the tournament so far. Yes, I'd probably go with that, actually. I was at it. Maybe it wasn't the best in terms of quality, in that there's been other games where there's been, say, a higher application of ability. But what the World Cup is really about in that sort of sense is theatre. It's the drama of it all, and this game had it in spades. Obviously, I mean, there was a narrative element as well. It was Messi going in his, what many believe will be his last World Cup and his last chance to win it. On the other side, it was Louis van Gaal. There was Messi producing that moment in the first few minutes to set up the first goal. There was his penalty. There was Netherlands' comeback and the nature of it, especially with Wout Weghorst scoring, I mean, the first goal in the way he did, and then the second goal, the complete opposite, which was a really clever free kick along the ground. Then there was all the drama of extra time, which was incredible. I thought Argentina responded really well. It felt like they were pushing the Dutch right to the distance, should have made it 3-2. And then, of course, the penalty shootout was almost this kind of play in itself, especially with all the emotion around it and the provocation from both sides. So from that perspective, it's difficult to think of a game that has had as much from start to finish. The one thing I should also mention with that game, it will go down as a World Cup classic, but I suppose outside the football and something far more serious, it was sadly the game where the American journalist Grant Wall, who a lot of us knew personally, passed. There was a fitting tribute to him at the France-England game the next night. He was shown on the big screen and his seat has a picture on. So I don't think that should go without mention. Scully asks if Modric is entering top 5 of all time territory, easily the best of the last 2 or 3 generations. Ooh, that's a very good question. Modric is obviously absolutely brilliant. One of the best midfielders ever, certainly in controlling the game in that way. But I suppose when we're talking about the top 5 of all time, that's sort of these players that have this transcendent ability that's reshaped the sport and brought it to new levels, or done something that's really beyond those. I mean, what Modric does, it's kind of like performing to an exceptionally high level very consistently. And he's not the only one who's done that. I mean, he's similar to kind of Pirlo in that way, to Xavi, whereas I think the level you're talking about is really, it's Messi, it's Pele, it's Maradona, it's Cruyff, it's Di Stefano, that these players that go beyond that. So from that perspective, I wouldn't quite agree with you, but I do think, yeah, he's one of the most consistent and high-performing players of the last 2 or 3 generations. And it doesn't really feel like there's actually many midfielders in the modern game like him. And finally, Nimesh asks, if this is the last we see of Neymar at a World Cup, would you consider him to be in the top 3 of his generation? Given the next World Cup is America, and I am told that Neymar has a lot of focus on being a big star in America in that way, I think he'll be determined to play at that. So I don't think this will be his last World Cup. As to whether I consider him top 3 of his generation, no. It does feel like going to Paris Saint-Germain has been the wrong decision. He went there to be the main star in his own right, but it's just meant he's been indulged. He hasn't kind of pushed himself to the maximum. And that came across with Brazil, where it just didn't seem like he worked in the system. And that's the modern game now. And I think ability-wise, yes, he's up there as one of the top 3 of his generation. In terms of application of that ability, it's highly questionable. And I think there's a few players with a claim ahead of him, not least people like Mohamed Salah, Lewandowski, Mbappe, obviously. And this is obviously before we get to Ronaldo or Messi. So it does feed into kind of a career that remains frustrating. So thank you for all your questions. Keep up to date with all the news from Qatar 2022 with Independent Sport, and watch more on Independent TV. We'll see you again soon on You Ask the Questions.